What happened to women who tried to escape slavery in ancient Rome will shock you. She rose from the thin mat she called a bed, rubbing the sleep from her eyes, already aware that her day would be long and unforgiving. Every morning was the same. Rising early, preparing food, cleaning the rooms, and serving the whims of the family she did not belong to. Julia was a slave, and in ancient Rome her life was never truly her own. The house itself was grand, with tall columns lining the courtyard and walls painted in vibrant colors that spoke of wealth and status. But to Julia, the beauty of the place meant little. It was a cage, and every decoration, every sparkling surface reminded her of what she would never have: freedom. The wealthy family she served moved about with ease, their clothes elegant, their movements leisurely, and their voices commanding. To them, Julia and the other slaves were invisible, except when they were needed. As she swept the courtyard, Julia's mind wandered to memories of her childhood. She had been taken from her village when she was barely a girl, sold into slavery and brought to Rome. Her parents had cried as merchants led her away, and she had struggled to call out to them, but no one had listened. Those memories were sharp, like the edge of a knife, and they often returned in moments of quiet. She clutched the broom tighter, trying to push them away, focusing instead on the duties ahead. The morning tasks were relentless. She drew water from the stone well, careful not to spill a single drop. Then she helped prepare bread and porridge, carrying heavy baskets from the kitchen to the dining area. Every step she took was measured, every movement watched. The house was full of servants, each assigned to a different role, yet the unspoken rules were clear. Mistakes were punished, laziness was punished, even hesitation could be punished. Julia had learned quickly that survival required obedience, even if her heart screamed for more. In the shadows of the household, she found small comforts. Other women like her whispered stories while washing the floors or mending torn garments. They shared news from the marketplace, tales of freedmen who had once been slaves, and rumors of families trying to reunite with lost children. These stories were dangerous, but they were also lifelines. Julia clung to them, allowing herself brief moments of hope, imagining what it would be like to be free, to walk the streets without fear, to make choices for herself. Yet hope was fragile in a world ruled by masters and guards. Julia had seen what happened to those who dared to disobey. She remembered a woman from another household who had been caught trying to sneak out at night. Her punishment was brutal, and the memory haunted Julia. Still, the thought of freedom lingered in her mind, stubborn and unyielding, like a flame refusing to be extinguished. The day moved on with relentless pace. Julia cleaned the rooms, polished the silver, and carried trays of food to the family members who barely looked at her, speaking only when necessary. She served their meals, refilled their wine, and endured the sharp words of the lady of the house, who found pleasure in reminding Julia of her place. Every insult, every harsh word chipped away at her spirit, yet she endured, knowing that survival required endurance. During a brief pause in her work, Julia found herself near the courtyard fountain, its water sparkling in the morning sun. She leaned against the stone edge, watching the water flow, and allowed herself a quiet thought. There must be more to life than this. Her gaze drifted to the street outside, imagining the bustling market, the laughter of children, the freedom to move without fear. These thoughts were dangerous, yet she could not stop herself. In her mind, she began to form the first faint outlines of a plan, though even thinking of escape brought a tightening in her chest. Life in the household was not only physically demanding but emotionally exhausting. Julia had to navigate the moods of her masters carefully. One day, a simple mistake, placing a cup slightly out of reach, could earn her a harsh word or worse. The masters were unpredictable, their tempers sudden and sharp. Slaves had to learn to anticipate their whims, to read their expressions, and to move like shadows, invisible but always present. Julia had become skilled at this dance, learning when to speak, when to remain silent, and when to disappear into the background. Her companions in the household were a mix of women, men, and children, all bound by the same invisible chains. Friendships were fragile, yet they existed, built on shared suffering and mutual understanding. Julia often spoke quietly with another young woman, Livia, who had been a slave for many years. They exchanged small comforts, a shared piece of bread, a whispered word of encouragement, a comforting smile when the day became too heavy. These small acts of kindness kept their spirits alive. Even when their bodies ached, and their hearts longed for freedom. One evening, as Julia returned from fetching water, she overheard a conversation between the master of the house and a merchant. The words made her heart sink. She might be sold, sent to another household, or married off against her will. Fear gripped her chest, tight and heavy. The thought of leaving behind the few friends she had, of being thrust into an even harsher life, was unbearable. And yet this fear planted a seed of determination. If she did not act, she could lose any chance at control over her own life forever. Julia began to pay closer attention to the comings and goings of the household. She noticed the schedules of the guards, the times when the streets were less crowded, and the quiet corners where she could hide. Every detail was a piece of a puzzle she hoped one day to solve. In her mind, the idea of escape became more than a dream. It became a possibility, fragile but alive. Despite the constant labor and fear, Julia found moments of quiet reflection. She would sit by the small garden at the back of the house, feeling the grass beneath her hands and listening to the rustle of the leaves. These moments reminded her of the world beyond the walls, a world she longed to know. She imagined walking through open fields, feeling the wind on her face, hearing the laughter of children who were not slaves. These thoughts gave her strength, even if they were fleeting. But the reality of her life was never far away. The house was a place of strict rules and harsh punishments. Slaves who made mistakes were beaten, confined, or sent to harsher work. Julia had witnessed it all, and it had taught her the value of caution and patience. She understood that any plan for escape would require careful thought, timing, and courage beyond what most could muster. Yet the desire for freedom burned within her, relentless and powerful. Even as she performed her daily chores, Julia's mind often wandered to the possibility of a different life. She imagined herself walking freely through the streets, speaking to people without fear, making choices that were her own. The longing was painful, but it also gave her a quiet determination. She began to notice small opportunities, listening to whispers of other women who had thought of running away, learning from their stories and mistakes. Each story became a lesson, a small piece of knowledge she could use to plan her own future. By the end of the day, Julia was exhausted. Her body ached from endless labor, but her mind was alive with thoughts of escape and freedom. She lay on her thin mat, staring at the ceiling, imagining a life beyond the walls that confined her. Sleep came slowly as her thoughts raced with possibilities and fears. Yet even in her exhaustion, a small spark of hope glimmered. It was fragile, but it was there, and it refused to be extinguished. Julia's life in the Roman household was harsh, unyielding, and at times terrifying. But it was also a life that shaped her determination, her intelligence, and her courage. Every day of labor, every insult endured, every whispered conversation with fellow slaves prepared her for the challenge she knew might come, the possibility of escape. And as she drifted into a restless sleep, she held onto a single thought. One day, she would find a way to live her life on her own terms. Julia's heart raced every time she moved through the corridors of the Roman household. Each step was careful, measured, because she knew that any sudden movement, any sign of hesitation, could draw the attention of her masters or the guards. The fear of punishment was constant, but the thought of freedom burned even brighter in her mind. She had endured so much already, and now, more than ever, she could not ignore the growing desire to escape the life that had been forced upon her. She began to pay attention to every detail of her surroundings. The guards who patrolled the streets, the times when the household doors were left slightly ajar, the moments when the masters were distracted by visitors, these were the moments she studied. Julia had learned that knowledge was as powerful as strength. She could not overpower anyone, but if she knew when and where to move, she might find a chance to slip away unnoticed. At night, when the household had gone silent, she would lie on her thin mat, thinking about her plan. She remembered the stories whispered by other women who had tried to escape. Some had succeeded, though few. Many had been caught and punished severely. Those stories were frightening, but they were also lessons. Julia studied them carefully, noting the mistakes others had made, and promising herself that she would not repeat them. She found an ally in Livia, the older slave woman who had worked in the household for many years. Livia had seen the harshest punishments and survived. She knew the secret paths, the hidden alleys, and the timing of guards. Julia spoke to her in hushed tones whenever they could be alone. "I want to leave," Julia confessed one night, her voice barely audible. "I cannot stay here anymore. I must try." Livia looked at her with a mixture of caution and understanding. "It is dangerous," she said. "Many have tried and failed, but I see the fire in your eyes. If you are determined, you must be careful. Watch, wait, and listen. Learn everything you can before you move." Julia nodded. She realized that rushing could ruin everything. Planning was not just about timing, it was about patience, observation, and cleverness. Over the following weeks, she watched the guards, memorized their routes, and noted the times when the streets were quietest. She learned the habits of the masters, which doors were locked, which keys were used, and where she might find hiding places if someone came searching. Every detail was important. Every observation could mean the difference between freedom and punishment. She also began to gather small supplies. She would quietly hide scraps of bread, small pieces of cloth, and coins she had managed to keep. Each item was insignificant on its own, but together they could help her survive if she managed to leave the household. Julia knew that leaving without preparation would be foolish. She needed tools, food, and a plan for where she might go next. The most difficult part was keeping her intentions a secret. Every glance she made, every conversation she had to be carefully controlled. Julia could not trust everyone. Some slaves might betray her out of fear or hope for reward. She learned to speak in riddles, to nod subtly when planning, and to keep her face calm even when her heart pounded with excitement. One evening, she overheard a conversation between two merchants visiting the household. They spoke of freed slaves, people who had escaped and found work or safety elsewhere. Julia listened carefully, hiding in the shadows. "They say some managed to reach other cities," one merchant said. "But it is not easy. Roads are watched, strangers are suspicious. A single mistake can be fatal." The words were both frightening and inspiring. Julia realized that escape was not just about leaving the house. It was about moving through a world filled with unknown dangers. She would need courage, intelligence, and a careful plan. But she also knew that the alternative, remaining a slave, was unbearable. Julia began to imagine the path she might take. She considered the marketplace, where crowds might help her blend in. She thought about the river, its banks hidden from the main roads, offering a chance to move quietly. Every detail was imagined in her mind. When she would leave, where she would hide, how she would avoid guards. The plan was not yet complete, but it was growing stronger with each passing day. She also thought about other women, friends who shared her life in the household. Could they escape too? Some were too fearful, some too weak, and some lacked the courage she had begun to gather. Julia knew she could not force them, and she could not wait for others to act. Her freedom, if it came, would be hers alone. Even as she planned, Julia faced setbacks. One day, she was nearly caught sneaking into the courtyard to watch the guards' movements. Her heart had raced so fast that she thought she might faint. She had hidden behind a column, barely avoiding detection. That moment taught her the importance of patience and caution. No matter how desperate she felt, she could not act without careful preparation. She spent nights practicing silent movements, slipping along the walls, and imagining herself moving unnoticed. She practiced climbing small fences and jumping over narrow gaps, testing her strength and agility. It was exhausting work, but it made her feel alive. Every small success, every skill she honed, gave her a sense of confidence she had never felt before. Julia also began to gather information about the surrounding area. She learned which streets were busy during the day, which paths were quiet at night, and where sympathetic people might live, freedmen, merchants, or travelers who might offer help. She memorized the layout of the city near the household, imagining the paths she could take and the places she could hide. Knowledge became her weapon, and she wielded it with care. Livia continued to guide her. "Remember," Livia said one night, "courage alone is not enough. You need patience. You need to watch and wait. Freedom comes to those who are clever as well as brave." Julia nodded, understanding that this was more than a physical challenge. It was a test of her mind and spirit. In her quiet moments, Julia imagined the life she wanted, walking freely, speaking her mind, choosing her own path. These thoughts were both comforting and painful. Comforting because they reminded her of what was possible, painful because they reminded her of what she had lost. She felt grief for the life stolen from her, but she also felt determination. If she could plan well, act wisely, and take the right moment, she could reclaim her life. Julia began to take small risks to test her plan. She would step outside the house when she was not supposed to, watching the streets carefully, measuring distances, noting where she could hide. Each experiment taught her something new, each mistake a lesson. The risks were frightening, but the lessons were invaluable. With every day, she grew more prepared, more confident, more ready. The most challenging part of her planning was keeping her emotions under control. Fear and excitement were constant companions, and she had to learn to mask them. She could not allow her masters or fellow slaves to see her true intentions. Her calm exterior became her shield, protecting the fragile hope growing inside her. Finally, after weeks of careful observation, gathering supplies, and mental preparation, Julia felt that she was ready. The plan was not perfect. There were no guarantees, but it was the best chance she had. She had memorized the guards' schedules, chosen the streets she would use, hidden small supplies, and prepared for what might happen if she were discovered. She shared her plan only with Livia, who gave her a final piece of advice. Trust your instincts. Be careful, be clever, and remember that freedom is worth every risk. But do not act until the moment is right. Patience will keep you alive. Julia nodded, feeling a mixture of fear and excitement. The thought of leaving the household, stepping into the unknown, was terrifying. Yet it was also exhilarating. For the first time, she felt a sense of control over her own destiny. The life of a slave had been imposed upon her, but now, for the first time, she could imagine a life of her own making. Each day leading up to her attempt, Julia became more vigilant. She moved silently through the house, avoided unnecessary attention, and checked her supplies. She rehearsed her escape in her mind, step by step, imagining every obstacle and how she would overcome it. Every detail mattered. Every decision could mean success or failure. Even as she prepared, Julia allowed herself brief moments of hope. She imagined walking through the streets, feeling the sun on her face without fear, blending into the crowds, and finally, living as a free woman. These thoughts fueled her determination, giving her the courage to continue planning despite the dangers. And so Julia waited, watched, and prepared. Every day was a test of patience, every night a lesson in careful planning. The desire for freedom burned brightly within her, and she knew that when the right moment came, she would act. The thought of life beyond the household kept her moving forward, step by careful step, toward the day when she might finally be free. The night had fallen quietly over the city of Rome. The streets were mostly empty, lit only by the soft glow of oil lamps swaying in the evening breeze. Julia lay awake on her thin mat, her heart racing with anticipation. Tonight was the night she had been preparing for, the night that might finally bring her the freedom she had longed for her entire life. Every detail of her plan played through her mind, rehearsed countless times. The timing, the routes, the hiding spots, everything had to be perfect. She rose slowly, careful not to make a sound. Her hands trembled slightly, but she forced herself to move with the precision of months of preparation. Julia dressed in dark clothing that would help her blend into the shadows, and tied her hair back tightly so it would not give her away. She checked the small bag of supplies she had hidden earlier, a few pieces of bread, some water in a clay flask, and a piece of cloth she could use if she needed to hide or cover herself. Every item was crucial. Every small preparation mattered. Julia waited until the household had fallen completely silent. The masters were asleep, the servants were resting, and the guards had settled into their evening routines. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of fear and hope pressing against her chest. One step at a time, she moved toward the outer door, listening carefully for any signs of movement. The lock was familiar from her previous observations. She eased it open, her fingers steady despite the pounding of her heart. Once outside, the cool night air brushed against her face, and she felt a thrill she had never experienced before. She moved quickly but silently, sticking to the shadows of the walls, keeping her body low and avoiding the main streets. Every noise, a distant dog barking, a cart rolling over cobblestones, made her pause, but she reminded herself that she had planned for this. She was alert, careful, and determined. The streets were eerily quiet, and Julia felt a mixture of fear and exhilaration. She had practiced this route many times in her mind, but now it was real. Every step carried risk, yet every step brought her closer to freedom. She passed a row of sleeping homes and small shops, moving from shadow to shadow, counting each step carefully. She remembered Livia's advice. Patience, cleverness, and awareness were as important as courage. Suddenly, a patrol of guards appeared ahead, moving slowly down the street. Julia froze, pressing herself against the wall of a nearby building. She held her breath as they passed, her body tense and ready to move if necessary. The guards glanced briefly at the shadows but continued on, unaware of the small figure waiting silently to continue her journey. Her heart thumped violently, but relief washed over her as the danger passed. She had made it through the first challenge. Julia continued along her carefully planned route, keeping to narrow alleys and hidden paths. She avoided the main roads where travelers or merchants might be awake. Her mind worked quickly, thinking ahead to each possible obstacle. She reminded herself not to panic, not to rush, and not to make noise. Every movement was calculated, every decision deliberate. At one point, she reached a small square where a few travelers were still awake, talking quietly among themselves. She pressed herself against the side of a building, holding her breath as the men laughed and argued. Their voices were loud in the silence, but they paid her no attention. She waited patiently, and when they moved on, she continued along her route, closer now to the part of the city she had been dreaming of for months. Her journey was not without difficulties. A stray dog barked suddenly in the distance, causing her to freeze. She crouched behind a barrel, her hands gripping the edge, listening carefully until the noise faded. Every small sound seemed magnified in the night, every movement of a shadow a potential threat. Julia felt her heart racing, but she reminded herself that she had prepared for these moments. Fear was natural, but she could not let it control her. As she moved further, the streets became narrower and the houses closer together. Julia knew that she was nearing the river she had planned to use as a hiding spot. The riverbank was quiet and offered cover, with reeds and low bushes where she could rest if necessary. She quickened her pace slightly, careful not to make noise, eager to reach the relative safety of her hiding place. When she finally reached the riverbank, she crouched low, letting the darkness hide her. The water reflected the moonlight, and she felt a moment of awe. This was the first time in her life she had been outside the confines of the household without fear of immediate punishment. She allowed herself a small smile, feeling the rush of freedom, even if it was only temporary. Julia did not linger. She knew the river could be dangerous if she stayed too long, as guards occasionally patrolled the banks at night. She moved along the water's edge, careful to stay hidden, using the reeds and bushes as cover. Her mind was alert, scanning for any sign of danger. She remembered the stories of women who had been caught near the river and knew she could not afford a mistake. Suddenly, she heard footsteps approaching from behind. Her heart skipped a beat. She pressed herself against the reeds, holding her breath. The footsteps grew louder and a figure appeared in the dim moonlight. Julia's body tensed, ready to run if necessary, but the figure passed by without noticing her. Relief washed over her, and she allowed herself to continue along the riverbank, her steps careful and silent. As she moved, Julia began to think ahead. The next part of her journey would take her through open roads and crowded areas, where the risk of being recognized was higher. She reminded herself to stay calm, to observe carefully, and to blend in as much as possible. Her training, preparation, and patience were her greatest allies. Hours passed as she moved through the city, the first hints of dawn beginning to appear on the horizon. Julia felt exhausted but determined. The physical strain was heavy, but her mind remained focused. Every step brought her closer to a life she had only imagined, a life of her own making. She reminded herself that she could not stop now. The world beyond the city awaited her, full of unknowns, but also full of possibility. As she approached the market area, she had to be especially careful. Merchants were setting up for the day, and early shoppers were beginning to appear. Julia used the shadows of buildings and carts to move unseen, sticking to the edges of the streets. She walked quickly but cautiously, careful to appear as though she belonged. Every glance around, every movement of a passerby was analyzed in her mind. She could not afford to draw attention. At one point, she nearly collided with a man carrying a large basket of fruit. She stepped back quickly, bowing slightly as if she were a passerby in a hurry. The man grunted but continued on, paying her no attention. Julia exhaled silently, realizing how close she had come to being noticed. Her heart pounded, but she continued forward, each step a mixture of fear and exhilaration. Finally, after hours of careful movement, Julia reached a quiet street on the edge of the city. Here, the buildings were less dense and the crowds were sparse. She allowed herself a brief moment of relief, knowing that the hardest part of her journey was behind her. Yet she remained vigilant, aware that the path ahead was still filled with uncertainty. Julia paused for a moment, crouched behind a wall and looked back at the city she was leaving. The familiar streets, the household that had confined her for so long, the lives of others who had never known freedom, all of it was behind her now. A mixture of sadness and relief washed over her. She had risked everything for this moment, and she had succeeded so far. The river, the alleys, the hidden paths, all had served her well. Her careful planning and observation had paid off. She realized that courage alone would not have been enough. It was her patience, her intelligence, and her careful preparation that had allowed her to move undetected through the city. Julia felt a sense of pride she had never known before, a quiet confidence that gave her strength for the journey ahead. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky with shades of pink and gold, Julia continued along her path. She moved toward the countryside, where open fields and forests offered both danger and opportunity. She knew that she could not stop yet, that freedom required continuous vigilance and careful movement. The world beyond the city was vast and unknown, but it was also full of possibility, a place where she could begin to shape her own destiny. Every step carried her further from slavery and closer to the life she had dreamed of. The exhaustion, the fear, and the danger were still present, but they were outweighed by the hope and determination that fueled her journey. Julia had risked everything, and so far she had succeeded. As she disappeared into the distant fields, the city behind her slowly waking to a new day, Julia felt a quiet joy. She was free, at least for now, and every careful step she had taken had brought her closer to the life she longed for. She moved with determination, knowing that her journey was only beginning, but also knowing that she had taken the most important step of all. She had claimed the possibility of freedom. Julia moved through the countryside cautiously, every step measured, her senses alert to any sound or movement. The freedom she had tasted was exhilarating, but she knew that danger was never far away. Runaway slaves faced countless risks in ancient Rome. Soldiers patrolled roads, villagers sometimes reported strangers, and the world outside the city was unfamiliar and unforgiving. Julia understood that escaping the household was only the first step. Survival would require patience, intelligence, and resilience. As she walked, she remembered the stories she had heard from other women in the household, stories of those who had been caught while attempting escape. Their punishments were harsh, often terrifying. Some had been confined for months with little food, others beaten for daring to flee, and some were sent to harsher labor in distant estates. These stories were meant to frighten, but Julia carried them as lessons. She had studied their mistakes carefully, promising herself that she would not repeat them. After several hours, she reached a small, forested area at the edge of the fields. She crouched beneath the thick branches of an old oak tree, letting the leaves hide her from view. Here she allowed herself to rest for a moment, taking a small piece of bread from her bag and drinking water from the flask she had brought. Her body ached, her legs were stiff, and her stomach growled, but her spirit felt lighter than it had in years. The first taste of freedom, even in brief pauses like this, was a gift she cherished deeply. Julia's rest was short. She knew she could not linger, as staying too long in one place could be dangerous. She also had to think about where she would go next. The countryside offered some cover, but it was also a place where travelers and soldiers moved unpredictably. She had to find a balance, concealment for safety, but movement to reach places where she could live more securely. She decided to head toward a small village she had observed from a distance, hoping she might find friendly faces or a market where she could blend in. Her journey was not without moments of fear. The sounds of the forest were alive with movement, the rustle of animals in the underbrush, the wind through the trees, and the occasional snap of a twig that made her jump. Julia reminded herself that these were ordinary sounds, not threats, but each one tested her nerves. She had learned to keep her heart steady, to breathe slowly, and to keep her mind focused on her goal. As she neared the village, Julia observed the people carefully. She stayed in the shadows, noticing which houses were occupied, where the guards might patrol, and which roads were less traveled. She had learned from her time in the household that caution was as important outside as it was inside. One wrong move could undo everything she had risked. In the village, Julia found some relief in observing the daily routines of the villagers. They went about their work, tending to animals, preparing food, and opening small stalls for trade. The rhythm of their lives was different from the rigid schedules of the household, and for a brief moment, Julia felt a glimmer of peace. She realized that the world outside the city was not only dangerous, but also full of ordinary people living ordinary lives, some of whom might be willing to help her. During her first day in the village, Julia found a small, quiet corner near the edge of the marketplace where she could hide and watch. She saw a few travelers and merchants who had been freed from slavery and were now living independently. Their stories reminded her of what could be possible. Some of them smiled kindly at her as she moved past, and she returned their smiles cautiously. She was careful not to draw attention, but she also recognized the importance of allies. Even small gestures of trust could make a difference. While observing the village, Julia learned more about survival in the outside world. She noticed which paths were safe, which houses might offer work in exchange for food, and where she could rest without fear of being discovered. Each observation became part of her growing understanding of life beyond slavery. Julia realized that freedom was not only about leaving the household, it was about learning how to live and thrive independently without anyone controlling her. She also thought about the women who had failed in their escape attempts. Their stories were not just warnings, they were lessons in resilience. One woman, she remembered, had been caught while trying to cross the river. She had been confined in a dark room for days with only minimal food and then forced to work in even harsher conditions. Another had been sent to a distant estate, far from family and friends, where her labor was relentless. Julia knew that she could not underestimate the dangers that awaited her even in freedom. Despite the constant awareness of risk, Julia also discovered moments of hope and kindness. Some villagers were willing to help travelers who appeared to be in need. She found an old woman who offered her a small meal and a place to rest for the night, asking only that Julia help with simple chores in return. Julia accepted, grateful for the kindness and careful not to reveal too much about herself. These small acts of generosity reminded her that the world was not only harsh and unforgiving. There were people who could be trusted and who could help her survive. Over the next few days, Julia continued to move cautiously, learning the patterns of life in the countryside and the village. She stayed out of sight during the day and moved mostly at night, when fewer people were awake. She avoided main roads and kept to quiet paths, always alert for signs of danger. Each step was a test of her courage and her intelligence, and each day brought a growing sense of confidence. She had survived the household and the city streets, and now she was learning to navigate the wider world. Julia also began to think more deeply about the women she had left behind in the household. She remembered Livia, who had guided her in planning the escape. She thought of other women who had shared their stories of suffering, courage, and hope. Julia realized that her journey was not only about her own freedom, but also about honoring their courage. Even though they remained in chains, their strength and resilience had given her the knowledge and inspiration she needed to act. In her moments of quiet reflection, Julia understood that survival required more than physical endurance. It required emotional strength and clever thinking. She learned to anticipate challenges, to plan for the unexpected, and to remain calm under pressure. Every lesson from her past, the punishments, the warnings, the whispered advice, became a tool she could use to navigate her new life. Freedom was not only about leaving the chains behind. It was about learning to live fully and wisely in a world that could be dangerous and unpredictable. As she moved through the village and countryside, Julia observed that other women, even those who had not escaped, found ways to resist in small ways. Some secretly learned to read and write, others developed skills that made them valuable, while some found subtle ways to claim small freedoms within the household. These acts of quiet resistance inspired Julia and reminded her that courage came in many forms, not only through bold escape, but also through persistence, intelligence, and resilience. Julia's confidence grew, but she remained cautious. She knew that danger was never far away, and that the guards and masters who sought runaway slaves could appear unexpectedly. She practiced moving quietly, hiding quickly, and blending in wherever she went. Her training from the household, her patience, observation skills, and careful planning served her well. Each day she survived reinforced her belief that freedom was possible, but only if she remained vigilant and clever. Over time, Julia began to interact cautiously with the villagers, learning more about the world outside slavery. She discovered that some people had once been slaves themselves and now lived freely, finding work, establishing homes, and even helping others who had escaped. Their stories were inspiring and educational. Julia listened carefully, learning which roads were safest, which towns were welcoming, and which areas she should avoid. Every conversation, every observation added to her knowledge and strengthened her resolve. Julia also recognized the importance of small acts of kindness. She offered help to villagers when she could, assisting with chores or carrying goods, always careful not to reveal too much about herself. These actions built trust and allowed her to move more freely, giving her opportunities to learn and rest safely. She understood that survival depended not only on cleverness, but also on building quiet connections in a world that could otherwise be hostile. Even as she adapted to life on the run, Julia remained aware of the harsh reality faced by others who had tried to escape and failed. She never forgot the women who had been punished, confined, or forced into harsher labor. Their suffering reminded her that freedom was fragile and that every step forward required vigilance. Julia's courage was fueled not only by the hope of her own future, but also by respect for the resilience of those who had endured before her. By the time she had been traveling for several weeks, Julia had become skilled at moving quietly, observing her surroundings, and making decisions quickly. She had learned to anticipate danger and to trust her instincts. Each challenge she faced, each obstacle she overcame, strengthened her confidence. She realized that freedom was not simply about leaving the household. It was about learning to live wisely, carefully, and bravely in a world filled with both danger and opportunity. Julia's journey was still far from over. The countryside offered safety in some areas, but presented new challenges in others. She needed to continue moving, finding places where she could rest and gather information, always careful to avoid roads and villages that might bring danger. Yet even as the path ahead remained uncertain, Julia felt a deep sense of accomplishment. She had survived the household, the city, and the first part of her journey into freedom. She had learned, observed, and adapted, and each day brought her closer to the life she had longed for. As night fell again, Julia found a quiet spot to rest. She leaned against a tree, her legs aching but her spirit strong. She thought of the women who had stayed behind, enduring their daily struggles with quiet courage. She thought of Livia, who had guided her with wisdom and patience. And she thought of herself, moving forward one careful step at a time, learning the lessons of survival and freedom. In that moment, she understood that courage was not only about daring acts, but also about patience, intelligence, and resilience. Julia moved quietly through the early morning mist, her legs sore from days of travel, but her heart light with hope. The journey had been long, difficult, and filled with moments of fear, but she had survived. For the first time in her life, she could truly imagine a future that belonged to her. Every careful step, every small decision, every act of patience had brought her closer to freedom. And now, the thought of living a life of her own choosing filled her with a quiet joy. She entered a small village that she had heard about from other travelers, a place where freedmen and women had settled and built lives for themselves. The streets were busy with early morning activity, and the smell of fresh bread from the bakery mixed with the earthy scent of the surrounding fields. Julia kept to the edges of the village, observing the people as they moved about their work, learning their routines and habits. She had grown skilled at reading people, understanding when it was safe to approach and when to remain hidden. Julia soon found herself speaking quietly with an older woman who ran a small inn at the edge of the village. The woman had once been a slave herself, and she recognized the determination and cautiousness in Julia's eyes. She offered Julia a place to stay in exchange for helping with chores. Julia accepted gratefully, knowing that this small opportunity could give her the rest she needed and a chance to plan her next steps carefully. During her stay at the inn, Julia learned much about life as a free person in ancient Rome. She saw how former slaves could work, trade, and even earn a small income that allowed them to survive independently. She observed their interactions with the local villagers and noted how they built trust, avoided danger, and maintained a sense of dignity despite the hardships they had endured. Every detail was a lesson, and Julia absorbed it all with eagerness. She also reflected on her own journey. From the day she had first left the household to this moment, she had faced countless obstacles, guards, unfamiliar terrain, moments of exhaustion and fear. Yet each challenge had taught her something valuable. She had learned patience, observation, and careful decision-making. She had discovered the importance of allies, even small ones, and the value of quiet resilience. These lessons, she realized, were as important as the physical act of escaping. Julia began to understand that freedom was not only about leaving the chains behind, but also about learning to live in a world that was complex and unpredictable. She practiced moving through the village without drawing attention, helping the innkeeper, and observing the routines of those around her. Every day was a balance of caution and independence, and each day her confidence grew. She felt herself becoming not just a survivor, but a person capable of shaping her own destiny. Even as she built this new life, Julia thought often of the women she had left behind in the household and others like them across the city. Their struggles and courage had inspired her, and she carried their stories with her. She understood that not every woman could escape, and that many continued to endure harsh lives. Yet she also realized that resistance came in many forms. Quiet endurance, learning skills, helping others, and small acts of defiance were all ways in which enslaved women claimed a sense of agency. Julia shared her experiences carefully with other women at the inn, particularly those who were curious about freedom or who had escaped recently. She spoke in hushed tones, recounting the lessons she had learned, the dangers she had faced, and the strategies that had helped her survive. She emphasized caution and patience, knowing that boldness alone could be deadly. Her stories became a source of guidance and hope for others who dreamed of life beyond slavery. She also thought about the role of memory in freedom. Julia understood that remembering the hardships she had endured, the lessons she had learned, and the people who had helped her was essential. Memory was a tool, a guide for future decisions, and a source of strength. She carried these memories with her, not as burdens, but as fuel for resilience and courage. Each recollection reinforced her sense of purpose and determination. Life in the village was not without its challenges. Julia had to find ways to earn her keep and ensure she could survive independently. She helped the innkeeper with cooking, cleaning, and managing guests, all while remaining careful not to attract attention from outsiders who might question her background. She learned about trade, the value of money, and the importance of careful planning. Each day brought new lessons, and each lesson strengthened her independence. Julia also became aware of the importance of community. She noticed how freedmen and women supported one another, shared knowledge, and offered protection in subtle ways. The bonds of trust and cooperation were essential for survival, and Julia made efforts to integrate herself into this network. She learned that freedom was not only about acting alone, but also about finding allies and participating in a supportive community. Over time, Julia began to experience a deeper sense of peace. She could move through the village without fear of punishment, speak freely, and make decisions about her daily life. The sense of control over her own destiny was exhilarating, but she never forgot the struggles that had brought her to this point. She remembered the household, the guards, the long nights of planning, and the moments of fear on her escape journey. These memories gave her perspective and gratitude for the life she was now building. Julia also began to reflect on the broader meaning of her experience. She understood that freedom was fragile and required ongoing awareness, patience, and effort. The world could be unpredictable, and challenges were inevitable. Yet, the knowledge that she had survived and learned to navigate danger gave her confidence. She had discovered that courage was not only about bold actions, but also about careful thought, adaptability, and emotional strength. As Julia settled into her new life, she started thinking about the future. She wanted to continue learning, to build skills, and to find ways to help others who were still trapped in slavery. She recognized that her experience could serve as a guide, a lesson in resilience and strategy. By sharing her story carefully, she could inspire others to seek freedom safely and wisely. In this way, her personal journey became part of a larger legacy of resistance and hope. She also considered the emotional aspects of freedom. For the first time, Julia could make choices for herself, feel a sense of safety, and plan her days according to her own needs. These small freedoms, though simple, were profound. They gave her a sense of dignity, self-worth, and purpose that she had never known in the household. She realized that freedom was not only physical, but also emotional and mental, a complete reclamation of her life. Julia's reflection on her journey also deepened her understanding of courage. She recognized that courage was not only the act of running away, but also the strength to endure hardship, the patience to plan carefully, and the wisdom to act thoughtfully. Each small decision, each moment of observation, each step taken with care had been an act of bravery. Freedom had been achieved through a combination of strategy, resilience, and intelligence, not just boldness. She also thought about the women who had remained behind, enduring the daily hardships of slavery. Julia felt a mixture of sorrow and respect for them. She understood that their struggles were a form of quiet resistance, and that surviving under such conditions required its own kind of courage. Even those who could not escape were part of a larger story of resilience, endurance, and the human spirit's longing for freedom. Julia continued to build her life, learning more about the world and her place in it. She became skilled at finding work, managing her needs, and maintaining her safety. She learned about trade, communication, and travel, slowly expanding her knowledge and capabilities. Each day reinforced her independence, and each lesson increased her confidence. She was no longer merely a survivor. She was a woman capable of shaping her own destiny. Over time, Julia began to feel a sense of responsibility toward others. She shared her knowledge discreetly with newly freed individuals or those seeking guidance on how to survive after escaping slavery. Her experience became a source of wisdom and hope, showing that careful planning, courage, and resilience could lead to a better life. She understood that even small acts of guidance could make a significant difference in someone else's journey. In reflecting on her life, Julia realized that her journey was not only about personal freedom, but also about the legacy of resistance. The courage of women like her, both those who escaped and those who endured, created a hidden history of defiance and hope. Each story, each act of resilience, contributed to a collective memory that challenged the cruelty of slavery and celebrated the human spirit's desire for autonomy. Julia also understood that freedom was a continuing journey. It was not a single event, but a lifelong process of learning, adapting, and making choices that affirmed her independence. Each day required vigilance, wisdom, and courage. Yet she embraced this challenge, knowing that the life she now lived was built on her own decisions and her own strength. As she walked through the village one morning, Julia smiled at the people she passed, feeling a sense of connection and belonging she had never known. She had reclaimed her life, step by careful step, and she understood the value of patience, observation, and quiet courage. Her journey had been long and difficult, but it had taught her lessons that would last a lifetime. Julia often thought of the household she had left behind, the city she had escaped, and the people who had helped or inspired her along the way. Every memory, every experience shaped the person she had become. She carried these lessons with her, using them to guide her choices and to help others. In doing so, she honored the legacy of those who had endured, resisted, and hoped for a better life. Finally, Julia understood that her story, though personal, was part of something greater. It was a story of resilience, courage, and the unyielding desire for freedom. She knew that many women had suffered, struggled, and resisted in ways that history might not fully remember, but their courage lived on in the actions of those who followed. Julia felt proud, not only of her own journey, but of the invisible network of strength, hope, and resistance that had carried her forward. As the sun rose higher, illuminating the village and the fields beyond, Julia felt a profound sense of peace. She had survived, she had learned, and she had claimed a life that was her own. Her journey was complete in the sense that she had achieved freedom, but she understood that the lessons, courage, and wisdom she had gained would continue to guide her throughout her life. Julia's story became a quiet inspiration for others in the village. People who had once been enslaved or feared for their safety saw in her example a model of careful courage, resilience, and hope. Her journey reminded them that even in the darkest circumstances, planning, patience, and bravery could lead to freedom and dignity. And so, Julia lived each day with intention, guided by the lessons of her past and the possibilities of her future. She worked, observed, learned, and shared her wisdom. She celebrated the small freedoms of daily life, from choosing her work to speaking her mind, and she honored the courage of women who had suffered in silence. In doing so, Julia ensured that the spirit of resistance, hope, and freedom would endure.